Suffering from dry, tired, irritated eyes? Don't let dry eyes win. Use Sustain Pro. It hydrates, restores, and protects dry eyes for up to 12 hours. Sustain Pro. Triple action dry eye relief.
The History of the World podcast, written and presented by Chris Hasler. This is the History of the World podcast with me, Chris Hasler, and this is a special episode on the colony of New Netherland for History of the World podcast Illuminati member Ian van Alphen. At the beginning of the 17th century, global exploration was a major political activity for the wealthiest European nations, who were encouraging enterprise in order to bring the riches of newly discovered lands back to their own nations. The Dutch were happy to let their wealthiest entrepreneurs take advantage of the opportunities to fund their own private ventures, and so private companies were set up in order to organise the investments and distribute it effectively. The company favoured by the Dutch government was the Dutch East India Company, which was granted a monopoly on Asian trade activity, and so private investors would be invited to buy shares in the company in what was quite an unprecedented business practice at the time. The company became so powerful as a consequence that it developed the political power of a nation in its own right. For the Dutch East India Company, one of the most important strategies was to find the Northeast Passage, the Arctic sea route to the Far East, which had been searched for many decades, and especially by a great rival of the Dutch in terms of global exploration, the English. One English sea explorer called Henry Hudson had attempted to sail along the north coast of Russia thanks to the investment of English trading companies, but Hudson came back to England unsuccessfully, with stories of large barriers of ice preventing safe passage. It's possible that Hudson fell out of favour as the right sailor to get the job done, but the Dutch East India Company were willing to invest in him, and so Hudson took advantage of the new opportunity to fulfil his ambitions with them. This time, Hudson would be granted the command of a Dutch flyboat called the Halve Man, and he would set off along the north coast of Russia again. This time, it would be the same result. Ice would prevent his passage. Rather than go back to the Dutch Republic with another disappointing tale of failure, Hudson would turn his attention to the alternative Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage was an alternative but yet undiscovered means to reach the Far East by sea travel, but this time by navigating across the north of the American continent. This passage had been of interest to the English too, especially as they were now establishing colonies in North America, and Henry Hudson had some knowledge of them simply because of his English background. It was in July of 1609 that Henry Hudson took the Halve Men to the coast of Newfoundland and then onto the coast of Nova Scotia, all of which are now Canadian territories. The indigenous peoples of these lands were quite used to European visits by now. After sailing all the way down to Chesapeake Bay via Cape Cod, Hudson decided to turn back, but this time he would investigate the waterways and rivers of the coastline at a closer distance. The Delaware River proved unnavigable, so Hudson continued northwards and entered Lower Bay between Sandy Hook and Breezy Point, what we know today as the entrance to New York Harbour. Upon entering the harbour, Hudson recognised that he had options and chose the northbound river as it seemed the most likely to ultimately be a channel to the west. Unfortunately it wasn't, and Henry Hudson had no choice but to turn back. Hudson headed back across the Atlantic, but had a bit of a quandary. If he went back to the Dutch Republic, he may face repercussions for disobeying instructions and abandoning the northeast passage. So he chose the home nation of England, but the English were not best pleased with him either, effectively working for their enemies. Hudson would sail again in search of the Northwest Passage soon afterwards, but this time he never returned, disappearing into a body of water now named after him as Hudson Bay. The northbound river that Hudson attempted to navigate in the Halve Maen is now called the Hudson River, also in his honour. The Halve Maen and the journal written by one of Henry Hudson's crew members were taken back to the Dutch Republic. Dutch companies would show an interest in investigating the fur trade opportunities with the natives in this area of the Americas documented by Hudson's crew. The natives appeared to be friendly in the large part, but not completely. Hudson had had some serious trouble from some of the natives during his journeys. However, it was still felt that trade could be done, so seamen, including one Adrian Block, were sent to the areas explored by Henry Hudson in the early part of the 610s. Adrian Block attempted to map much of the area that Hudson had explored by exploring it himself in more detail. Block established a fur trading post at Fort Nassau, which was deep into the Hudson River Valley at the modern city of Albany. But competition was fierce between different Dutch companies competing for their share in the fur trade. In order to prevent costly altercations, these companies conceded that they should form a governing company responsible for ensuring fair and amicable competition, and so was created the New Netherland Company. The New Netherland Company applied to the Dutch government for an exclusive patent to be able to monopolise the fur trade of the Hudson River Valley and its surrounding area. The patent came into effect in 1614 and prevented other companies from being involved in this particular fur trade route and upsetting the lucrative equilibrium. The New Netherland Company did not have its patent renewed by the Dutch government when it expired in 1618, and this could be down to the fact that there was a bigger picture to be considered. The Dutch had had ongoing issues with the Habsburgs, who still occupied territory to their south in Europe, with control of the Habsburg Netherlands belonging to the Kingdom of Spain. The Dutch Republic wanted to encourage a monopoly similar to the Dutch East India Company that would be responsible in the large part for all of its transatlantic trade network, which would include their interests in Brazil and the Caribbean. It would be convenient for the business of New Netherland to be amalgamated into this monopoly, but the Spanish tried to deny the Dutch from forming this company within the terms of the peace agreement called the 12 Years' Truce between the two countries. Eventually, the importance and potential gains of such a well-organised equivalent became too large, and it would provide the resource necessary to help them stand up against Spanish oppression, and so the Dutch West India Company was formed. There would be a considerable opinion that the production of New Netherland would be increased if the Dutch were willing to consider the colonising of this area. This would mean finding individuals willing to settle in a new land on behalf of the Dutch West India Company and importing the necessary slave labour in order to sustain it. It would also mean having individuals who could negotiate with the indigenous American Indians to maintain peaceful relationships. It would not be easy to establish such a colony due to the investment required, but the pressures of other countries, such as the English establishing colonies further east on the coastal territories of the US state of Massachusetts, could become a threat to Dutch control of New Netherland in the long term, so the prospect of colonisation was becoming a necessity. The Dutch West India Company would transport Walloon and Flemish families, two distinct Low Countries ethnicities, over to New Netherland and settle them at Fort Orange, built in close proximity to Fort Nassau in the modern city of Albany, and on Governor's Island in New York Harbour, which the Dutch would call Notten Eiland. Other families were taken elsewhere across New Netherland, and so the colonisation of the modern city of New York and its surrounding areas by Europeans had begun.
Trade.
The initial opportunities between Dutch explorers and American natives were discovered by Henry Hudson's party, who encountered the natives, some friendly, others not so friendly, while travelling from New York Harbour up the Hudson River. One of the biggest discoveries by Europeans when arriving in the Americas was the tobacco plants, which would quickly become one of the most popular recreational drugs of the entire world. Hudson's crew would be offered tobacco in exchange for European knives, hatchets and beads. Other native offerings would include maize and pumpkins, two very American foodstuffs that have become popular worldwide. One of the largest trade attractions of the Native Americans were their furskins. The most popular pelt was that of the beaver, and this was certainly among the most popular individual items for which Dutch merchants were willing to go to great lengths to be able to gain stock of. Another naval explorer called Hendrik Christiansen would be directly involved in the initial exchanges of the Van Tweenhuizen Company, a Dutch company whose members would go on to form an important part of the New Netherland Company, and a company who would employ the services of Adrian Block. Despite us referring to the colonisation of Governor's Island as the origin of the city of New York, it is likely that Hendrik Christiansen built houses on the southern tip of Manhattan Island, with the name Manhattan being derived from the name given to the island by the locals, Mannahatta. It is suggested that Manhattan Island was no more than a hunting ground for the nomadic Native Americans. The Wequasgeek were a tribe from further north on the east banks of the Hudson River Valley, and are likely to have accessed the island from the modern borough of the Bronx, with the other tribes being the Canarsie, accessing Manhattan Island from their base in Long Island. The presence of a handful of European houses at the southern tip of Manhattan Island would have been of little concern to the Native Americans.
Governorship.
Trade with Native Americans was certainly not restricted to the Hudson River Valley. Cornelius Jacobson May was an explorer and trader who was actively involved in the reconnaissance missions of the New Netherland Company during its monopoly in the mid-1610s, around the same time as Adrian Block. After the New Netherland Company lost its patent in 1618, May was still sponsored to travel to New Netherland and trade with the locals. When the Dutch West India Company was granted the patent for trade in New Netherland, we have already learned that the company believed it necessary to colonise the area in order to protect it from rival Dutch companies and other European nations, with what the Dutch West India Company would deem to be illegal ambitions. May was invited to be involved in the process of the settlement of the first European families at Fort Orange and Nut Island, today's Albany and Governor's Island, and their livestock, which would include horses and cows, transported across the waters. May would assume the role of the director of New Netherland on behalf of the Dutch West India Company, and is likely to have been based on Governor's Island. But he would have also been responsible for exploring the opportunities to colonise other areas of New Netherland, such as the Delaware River further south, which would not assume its modern name until the following century. There he would establish a fort called Fort Nassau, not to be confused with Adrian Block's Fort Nassau, along the Hudson River. May's Fort Nassau was built on the New Jersey side of the Delaware River as it passes through what has become the modern city of Philadelphia. May would oversee the settlement of European families in the Delaware River Valley, referred to in those days as the South River, and he would oversee the settlement of European families in the area of the modern US state of Connecticut. In 1625, the directorship of New Netherland passed into the hands of a man called Willem Verhulst, and then the following year it would be a man called Peter Minuit. This was quite a critical time in the story of the history of New York, because it was the time of the purchase of Manhattan Island from the Native Americans. This is something that New Yorkers see as the birth of their great city. Further scrutiny of the transaction suggests that this whole purchase agreement may have been dressed up for effect. The first thing that strikes me about this whole idea of a purchase is that there was absolutely no requirement for the European settlers to need to have full rights over Manhattan Island in its entirety. The island is over 22 square miles in size, and there would have only initially have been a few dozen settlers. The other thing is the suggestion that the purchase was made from the Munsee, who were a comparatively belligerent subtribe of the Lenape, although it's not clear where the Waquasgeek and the Canarsie came into this with their use of Manhattan Island, or whether the Munsee incorporated all of the tribes who spoke the wider group of Munsee languages. In short, there is a lot that is open to interpretation, and it is highly unlikely that Native Americans knowingly sold the entire island to Europeans for the value of 60 guilders, as described in a letter written by a man called Peter Schachen in 1626. It may be that the locals believed that they sold the rights to use the land for a period of time. If we look at a similar contract to rights to use particular lands on Staten Island, then it appears that European settlers were selling advanced wares created using modern technology not known to the Native Americans. Peter Minuit is named as the man behind these land purchase deals, but Willem Verhulst may have had a hand in the Manhattan purchase. Whatever happened, more Europeans started building on the southern tip of Manhattan Island, and this was the beginnings of Fort Amsterdam. The directors were expected to consult with a representative council in the New Netherland before making any vital decisions in regards to the colony. Willem Verhulst's tenure appears to be quite brief, and there is a suggestion that he wasn't a popular director. Peter Minuit's lasted longer, but may have been ended after rumours of him turning a blind eye to illegal fur trading among the settlers not being declared to the Dutch West India Company. The settlers of the lands whose purchases were overseen by the director and his council were a diverse mixture of Europeans from a number of different nations looking for an opportunity to create their own private fortune, so it's hardly surprising to hear of some black market trading going on.
International competition.
As time went by and the directorship inevitably changed hands from one individual to another, the population of New Netherland would increase, with European babies being born on American soil and more migrants crossing the ocean to start their new life. During the 1630s, the English settlers of New England and of Virginia were growing more populous and more powerful, and this would bring them to the borders of New Netherland along the eastern seaboard to their east and to their south. At their easternmost fringes, the Dutch had built a trading post called Fort House of Hope near the Fresh River, which in modern terms was the origin of the city of Hartford on the Connecticut River, the river which had been explored by Adrian Block. However, English settlers also decided to establish settlements in close proximity to this Dutch fort from the 1630s. This would have concerned New Netherland, but they really didn't have as much resource invested in their colony as the English did, and so there was probably very little that they could do to combat it. They just had to deal with it in the best way possible. The former New Netherland director, Peter Minuit, was back in Europe when he was approached by the growing power of the Kingdom of Sweden to attempt to establish a Swedish trade colony in America, and so he obliged and created the colony of New Sweden on the Delaware River Valley. Once again, New Netherland was really not willing to battle with New Sweden because it felt that its own interests were better invested in the success of Manhattan Island.
William Kieft.
The sixth director of New Netherland was William Kieft, who assumed the role in 1638. He took over the role at around the time that the English colonists in the east had been involved in a conflict with the Pequots, who were American natives around the Connecticut River Valley. The New England settlers eliminated the Pequots and moved into their lands, thereby taking control of the river valley. But New Netherland still held their Fort House of Hope. By this time, the immigrant population of the colony of New Netherland likely exceeded 8,000 individuals, so there was a considerable presence and a considerable amount of people to satisfy. With such a large number of immigrants, diseases such as smallpox spread among the native population who had no immunity to it, and this would cause great numbers of deaths among the natives. It does seem that the settlers and the natives had learned to coexist, but there were always and often going to be disagreements and tensions between the two, and it would take a steady nerve to maintain control. However, it does seem that William Kieft would make some brash decisions about dealing with issues involving disagreements between settlers and natives, and about demanding tributes from the natives living in close proximity to New Netherland-controlled lands. It seems that the natives were not too interested in entertaining this idea, despite the fact that they reminded that New Netherlands defended them against the natives of their native enemies, sometimes natives supported by English and French colonists. The murder of a colonist by a native caused Kieft to call a meeting with representatives of the population who would go on to form a council. Kieft's motivation to call a council of the people was to take advice on what repercussions there would be for the murder. Whether his aim was to convince the council of people that there should be a general repercussion for the wider native tribe is a definite question to ask, because Kieft had demonstrated great indifference to the way that the natives were punished for their acts without trial, which also resulted in attacks on the natives for things that they were later found out to not be responsible for. The Council of the People took it upon themselves to advise Kieft on his administration of the colony, so Kieft ultimately dismissed them. So there was growing tension between Kieft and the particular native tribes, which divided opinions of the population and caused tension within the colony itself among the settlers. Brutal massacres of native tribes were seemingly rewarded by Kieft, which also encouraged revenge attacks by natives on colonist settlements. Some of the colonists actually appealed for help from the Dutch Republic to assist their desire to attack the natives, and this was done without Kieft's knowledge. The Dutch Republic passed the problem on to the Dutch West India Company, who by this time had grown indifferent about the fortunes of New Netherland due to them having higher priorities elsewhere. So the entire structure of administration of New Netherland was now in a complete mess. This period is retrospectively called Kieft's War. It was a period where the colony of New Netherland, headed by William Kieft and their native allies, were engaged in an ongoing battle against angered natives, much to the concern of many of the colonists, fearing for their own lives and fortunes. The Dutch West India Company sent a temporary director to New Netherland and instructed William Kieft to report back to the Dutch Republic following this disastrous sequence of events. Settlers were now deciding that New Netherland was not for them, and this meant that something needed to be done. While Kieft was back in the Dutch Republic, an uneasy truce was reached between the settlers and the Algonquian alliance, who were forced to concede to the power of the New Netherland province.
Peter Stuyvesant.
It appears that the Dutch West India Company had lost their faith in William Kieft's ability to manage the New Netherlands province, and they made plans to send one of their most trusted and able agents, Peter Stuyvesant, over to New Netherland to investigate some vital reforms to prevent further demoralisation of the colonists. Stuyvesant recognised that the authority of the Dutch West India Company would need to be maintained, so as much as he wanted to befriend the colonists, he would also need to maintain control for the company. He would initially clear out some troublesome representatives within the social hierarchy of New Netherland in order to strike a political equilibrium. The issue of William Kieft still feeling like he had been hard done by being recalled was dealt with by fortune when William Kieft was killed in a shipwreck just off the coast of Wales in 1647. This opened the door for Peter Stuyvesant to be the Director General of New Netherland. With the growing power of New England to the east and New Sweden to the south, it became clear that New Netherland was losing its borderlands and would need to change its entire view of itself to prevent itself from being engulfed by its European neighbours. The English colonists had already pushed the Dutch out of the Connecticut River Valley, causing New Netherland to have to abandon Fort House of Hope at the modern city of Hartford in the Connecticut River colony of New England. Stuyvesant would make it very clear that the remaining European settlers living around Fort Amsterdam on the southern tip of Manhattan Island needed to make an effort to improve their settlement by repairing the fort and creating institutional buildings for the community such as a church and a school. Hopefully this would encourage people to have their faith in New Netherland restored and prevent the colony from falling into the hands of another nation. Fort Orange upriver on the Hudson River from Fort Amsterdam was already in a position of thinking that its own fortunes would improve if it were just to take care of its own affairs, because as a settlement it had nurtured a unique and peaceful relationship with the natives that could only have been endangered by the disagreements further south. This prompted Stuyvesant to commission a second fur trading post just north of Fort Orange called Beverwijk, which alongside Fort Orange would eventually become the modern city of Albany. Stuyvesant would protect Beverwijk's right to the trade monopoly of the upper Hudson River Valley. When we look at Peter Stuyvesant, it seems that we are watching a highly capable man fighting a battle that he ultimately couldn't win. It was Stuyvesant who made the necessary arrangements to turn the settlements around Fort Amsterdam into a proper city community called New Amsterdam. Stuyvesant was powerless to prevent the westward expansions of the New England colonies, and as we mentioned previously, he had to allow them to take control of the Connecticut River Valley and its surrounding lands, much to the chagrin of Stuyvesant's official council of 9 men. Stuyvesant just did not have the manpower, arms and financial support of the Dutch West India Company available to him to do anything meaningful about it though. Back in Europe, and particularly in Northern Europe, the Kingdom of Sweden had become very powerful and a threat to the territories of Northern Europe, and particularly the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which the Swedes had invaded. This act gave Stuyvesant a justification to take an army into the lands occupied by New Sweden in the Delaware River Valley and take control of the lands that had been originally charted and mapped by Dutch explorers in any case, and therefore should belong to New Netherland. Stuyvesant was successful in this venture, and New Sweden was eliminated. Back in Europe, the tensions between the Dutch and the English was at its high point during this period, and it was due to the two countries trying to exert their dominance over the same local and global trade routes. Competition for global trade dominance between the European nations was fierce during the 17th century. The Dutch West India Company had been kicked out of their valuable colony in Brazil by the Portuguese, forcing a number of refugees to flee to New Netherland. But still, the Dutch West India Company were unable to send the resources that Stuyvesant desperately needed to improve the colony against the expansions of the New England colonies. When the monarchy of England had been restored in 1660, the new King Charles II was encouraged to demonstrate the strength of the monarchy by demonstrating its superiority over the Dutch by allowing private English vessels to attack Dutch ships and allowing his navy to capture Dutch trading posts. This was further extended by Charles, declaring that because the Italian explorer John Cabot had been sent under the commission of the Kingdom of England to explore the coast of North America right the way back in the late 15th century, that New Netherland was first explored by the English and therefore was the property of the English. He would award the Dutch province to his brother James, the Duke of York, and James would send one of his groom of the chambers, Richard Nichols, to sail across the Atlantic and claim New Netherland's surrender from Peter Stuyvesant in 1664. Stuyvesant was not interested in surrender, however, and so he made plans to defy the invasion, but the reality was that Stuyvesant simply did not have the resources to be able to resist the English, especially as he had spent a lot of the lead-up years to this fateful date in history fighting natives in the Esopus Wars. The English had no desire to be brutal towards the residents of New Netherland, though, as they promised liberty if they surrendered peacefully, and so the population believed that this was the only solution in any case. Peter Stuyvesant sent the Articles of Capitulation to the Dutch West India Company, which handed control of New Netherland to Richard Nichols, who promptly renamed New Amsterdam New York in honour of James, the Duke of York. Stuyvesant had to report back to the Dutch Republic, but he was able to return to New York City, where he went back to his farm that he had resided at during his time as Director General, and he lived out his final years until 1672. Stuyvesant's descendants are still closely associated with New York right up until the present day. It is very interesting to analyse Peter Stuyvesant's role in the creation of one of the most influential cities in the formation of modern American culture and values. The modern concept of freedom and liberty that is championed by the constitutional mantra of the United States of America is attributed historically to the attitudes of the early modern Dutch Republic who founded the city in the first place. The Dutch Republic was a haven of religious tolerance in the face of a very oppressive and intolerant Catholic attitude in Europe stemming from the late medieval period. Rather ironically, Peter Stuyvesant was very intolerant of religious pluralism in New Amsterdam, being firmly committed to the supremacy of the Dutch Reformed Church. So when the English arrived in New Amsterdam in 1664, despite the clear capabilities of Stuyvesant, many would have welcomed the change due to the likelihood of more freedom of religious practice without him. The English conquest of New Amsterdam was part of the escalation which led to outright conflict between the Netherlands and England in the Second Anglo-Dutch War, which despite the Dutch gaining the upper hand in, they gave up their claims on New Netherland. The English would split New Netherland into colonies similar to the ones established earlier in the century on the Connecticut River Valley, which are quite recognisable as the modern states of the USA, and in particular Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York and Pennsylvania. In the following decade, in the 1670s, the French encouraged the English to renew their conflicts with the Dutch, which prompted the Dutch to send a fleet of 21 ships across the Atlantic to New York City in 1673. The Dutch were actually successful in retaking the city 9 years after they had originally lost it, and in September 1673 had installed a man called Anthony Culver as the new Director General. The name of the city of New York was changed to New Orange, and the Dutch were back in charge. For those of you who may be surprised by this turn of events, you'll probably be unsurprised to learn that around 6 months later, at the conclusion of the Third Anglo-Dutch War, in the Treaty of Westminster, the city was restored to the English and its name reverted back to New York.
This episode is brought to you by Fox One. Watch all 104 matches of the FIFA World Cup live in 4K for just $19.99 a month with 3 days free. Build your own multi-view, choose up to 3 streams, and follow player spotlights. Stay on top of every moment with live stats, highlights, and instant replays. The FIFA World Cup, streaming live on Fox One. Offers are subject to change. See fox.com for complete terms and conditions.
Thank you very much for listening to this latest episode of the History of the World podcast about New Netherland, the fascinating story about the origin of New York City and of the surrounding US states and the origin of those states. Great subject choice there by Ian Van Alphen, who has contributed to the History of the World podcast. And as such is a member of the History of the World podcast Illuminati and earned the right to commission that special episode. So thank you, Ian, and I hope sincerely that you did enjoy that story.
The Ancient World Cup.
Well, this week was match number 10 in the second round, and it pitted the Minoans against the Huns, and all the votes were counted up. We had 41 votes across the various platforms, the Tapper Talk discussion forum, the History of the World podcast Facebook page, the History of the World podcast unofficial fan group, and the Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages Facebook page, and the Twitter account for the History of the World podcast. All the votes were gathered together, and going through to the next round to face the Romans will be the Minoans with 71% of the vote, which means that we have to say goodbye to the Huns, who only achieved 29% of the vote. So into the next stage, the last 16 for the Minoans. So thank you very much to everyone who voted. This week coming up will be match number 11, and we will be seeing the Parthians, who were the sort of the Bactrian Sogdiana area, sort of East Caspian Sea coastal peoples who managed to get control of the entirety of the Persian Empire, and did battle after sort of conquering the Seleucids, the Hellenistic Persians, and did plenty of battles with the Romans during the Roman heyday. So very powerful Parthian Persians. Against the Berbers of North Africa, the Berbers who are the indigenous people of the North African Maghreb and Tunisia, around the lands of ancient Carthage, and played a very important part in the relationship between the Romans and the subsequent Germanic tribes and the Arab peoples who came afterwards. So the very significant history to the North African indigenous people known as the Berbers. Voting will commence over the course of next week, and there you have it, the Parthians versus the Berbers. Don't forget to keep your eyes open on the social media and get ready to vote.
Listener messages and reviews.
History of the World podcast Illuminati member Lynn Dowling wrote in and said, "Hi Chris and fellow Illuminati. A friend recommended the John Reader book Africa, a Biography, so I checked it out from the library and was blown away. I learned so much, so I second Chris's opinion of it. Also, many years ago, early 80s, there was a great comedy, The Gods Must Be Crazy, about the Bushmen of the Kalahari. I see that it is now available on Hulu. I don't remember it being disrespectful, but apologise if parts of it were, perhaps. I just remember how thoroughly enjoyable it is. One gets to enjoy the clicking language they speak throughout the movie. I was curious to hear if Chris would try to speak it, and you didn't disappoint, Chris. You did a great job and showed a lot of courage by attempting it. Thanks for the debrief, Chris. I sure don't feel you owe us anything, but appreciate the thoughts anyway. Yes, of course, you're talking about the debrief audios, sort of 10-15 minute episodes that we make on the Patreon page. If you want to listen to them, you just simply sign up to become a member of the History of the World podcast Illuminati by visiting the Patreon page and opting to make a monthly contribution. You can listen to those debrief episodes we make every week after the main episode and just discuss some of the sources, the materials that we used when making the episode, and sometimes we look at what's coming up the following week as well. Yes, I'm aware of the film The Gods Must Be Crazy because a friend of mine told me about it a few weeks ago, and I wasn't aware of it before he told me about it. Yeah, but certainly, yes, we are talking about the same peoples, generally speaking, that were the feature of the podcast episode on the Khoisan. But thank you very much, Lynn, for your message. Russell Noland wrote in saying, just listening to the podcast where you talk about pronunciation of places and names. If there is no consensus, then You do what you feel is correct. You do you, Chris, and don't worry about a few Americans that cannot adjust. Keep up the great work, mate. Russ, well, I don't tend to get many Americans telling me that I need to adjust. But yeah, certainly the accent is not as common as maybe other podcasters, my accent. But then I also do want to show a bit of, respect to other cultures and their dialects. And certainly this came up last week, didn't it? I think when we were talking about the pronunciation, but using the pronunciation Chingis Khan instead of Genghis Khan, because it was much more in line with the Mongolian version of his name. So yeah, certainly I think as historians we do owe it to the global population to really try and consider that whether our version of names is far too anglicised for the global community. So yeah, that's certainly how I think, but everyone will have a different opinion. Thank you very much, Russell. Don McPhee wrote in and said, "Hey Chris, good day from Central Coast, New South Wales, Australia. Just wanted to drop you a line to say thank you for introducing me to the World of History podcast. I decided to start listening to the podcast when I was driving between Canberra and the Central Coast of New South Wales, about a 4-hour drive on an almost weekly basis. Always had a fascination with history, although I was never quite clear on where everything sat in the timeline of human history, as in which Persians were around at the Battle of Thermopylae and how they were different from the Parthians that killed Crassus, etc. Yours was the first podcast I discovered and was exactly what I was looking for in both content and presentation. After months of binging your series, I finally caught up and started looking for other podcasts to fill the gap in my drive. Since the high quality content of Hot World was my benchmark, many podcasts have been tried and left in the dust because they are just not up to the standard you have taught me to expect. I have since discovered several I enjoy, such as the History of English, Anthology of Heroes and the Short History of, and all thanks to Hot World getting me into the platform. Keep up the good work and be good." From Don. Thank you very much for the message, Don. Of course, many people will try their hand at history podcasting and they may not get the rewards from it that they maybe imagined that they would. Let's say it can be hard work to create a podcast, and I suppose you are going to get various you're going to get various attempts and various different standards. Sometimes the sound quality, if the sound quality isn't up to scratch, it can sort of take away from a very knowledgeable and capable presenter. So that can be a shame. So you have to sort of, I think, when you're podcasting, just make an effort to try and make it as listenable as possible. But thank you, Don. Very kind message. Moving on. Bill Morrison has written in and said, "Just found your excellent podcast and I'm currently at the early stages of the agricultural revolution. Brilliant work so far. Well done. I'm binge listening at home here in Switzerland." So thank you for writing in from Switzerland, Bill. I got another message from Russell Noland. A comment you made at the end of the special episode on Zoroastrianism resonated with me a great deal. The part religion plays as a motivating factor and incentive is sometimes underestimated in today's increasingly secular society. The great building projects of the ancient world were just as likely completed by peoples who were motivated by religious and spiritual beliefs than the lash or compulsory means. In my days of secondary school, it was taught that slaves were forced to complete all of these great works. Just a thought, cheerio. I suppose it always takes me back to the recent discoveries about the pyramid builders and how they stayed in very well looked after camps and were eating good food and were certainly not alien to a bit of a drink and a sing-song after a hard day's work. And it would have certainly, or so historians sort of believe, it was somewhat of an honour to be invited to take part in the building of these incredible monuments. So yes, I agree, Russell. I think you've tapped into something there quite significant. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this week's episode, and that sort of wraps it up for another week. Next week, bit of a strange scenario. So we're going to be doing another special episode, but this time it's going to be about the volcanic winter of the year 536. Now, this may be an unfamiliar subject for many of you, but this is a theory that come about due to some references in texts that caused a bit of a scientific investigation as to what may have happened. So this mysterious volcanic winter that was penned by some contemporaries who noticed significant changes in the weather conditions, it certainly deserves a thorough investigation. So we're going to do that next week, and tell the story of what we do know about this supposed volcanic winter of the year 536. And this subject is brought to you thanks to a member of the History of the World podcast, the Illuminati, Matt Hayden, who specially requested this topic. So thank you, Matt, and hopefully you're looking forward to next week when we dig a bit deeper into this mysterious event from almost 1500 years ago. So thanks for that, and hope to see you next week. Don't forget to check out the Patreon special. We're going to be doing like a 10-minute debrief. I'm going to put the kettle on, make yourself a cup of coffee, and chat a little bit about the sources used for this week's episode, and the challenges revolving around writing it. So I'll see you there, and otherwise, until next week, be good.
Even if you're using topical prescription creams for your child's eczema, you still might be hearing this. That relentless itching that makes them want to scratch and scratch and scratch and scratch. When their moderate to severe eczema isn't well controlled, it's time to ask about Dupixent, dupilumab, which isn't a cream, steroid, or immunosuppressant. Dupixent helps kids as young as 6 months stay ahead of their eczema with clearer skin and noticeably less itch. Severe allergic reactions, including skin reactions, can occur. Get help right away for face, mouth, tongue, or throat swelling, wheezing, or trouble breathing. Tell your doctor right away of new or worsening eye problems like eye pain or vision changes, skin symptoms, joint aches and pain, or a parasitic infection. Don't change or stop other treatments without talking to your doctor. Dupixent helps your child feel the heal. Ask your child's eczema specialist. Visit Dupixent.com or call 1-844-DUPIXENT.
The History of the World podcast, written and presented by Chris Hasler. Please consider making a financial contribution by going to the historyoftheworldpodcast.com website and clicking on the Patreon link. Email the show at historyoftheworldpodcast@mail.com. And don't forget to join our social media at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr. See you next time.